as a voice for the poor whose stories were erased, as a woman who walked into rooms where justice was always defined by status and skin. But today was different. Today, across from her sat a federal judge, a man who not only held the power to decide, but was wielding that power like a club, intent on crushing anyone who dared break the illusion of the show. She looked around. No allies, no sympathetic glances, only blank faces or ones secretly hoping she'd fail, so everything could return to the old order. An order in which she was never meant to exist. And in that stage of calculation and control, Alicia understood something crystal clear. If she stumbled today, they wouldn't just shut down a trial. They'd extinguish the hope of everyone who still believed the truth might stand a chance in this system. But Alicia Monroe hadn't come here to accept the role she'd been handed. She was not a supporting character. And even if every single person in this room chose to play the villain, she would be the one to rewrite the script. Alicia Monroe stood before the courtroom podium, a thick file in her hands. Not just papers, but the product of months of investigation. Budget reports, bank statements, wire transfers. Clear as day evidence showing that millions of dollars in public funds had been funneled into a shell company. One registered under the name of none other than Charles Stanton, the defendant. She began to speak. Her voice was calm, coherent, each number pronounced like the beat of a judge's gavel, summoning the gravity a courtroom should carry. But she had barely finished her opening sentence when Judge Whitaker's voice cut through, cold and razor-sharp. More numbers, nothing new. He leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked over his stomach as if forced to sit through a dull presentation by an underperforming student. No need to review the documents, no need to analyze. Just one frown, and Alicia's entire effort was dismissed as worthless. No one has time for all these messy figures, Whitaker added, casting a fleeting, condescending glance toward the defense attorney, like two men sharing a joke to which she was not invited. From the back rows, a small laugh escaped. Not joyous, but smirking, the kind of laugh reserved for those who don't know their place. Alicia remained upright, but inside her chest burned as if she had swallowed embers. The rage didn't come from being interrupted. It came from the collusion, the collective silence of the entire courtroom, from the judge to the clerk, from the bailiff to the reporters. Everyone was acting in sync. A familiar performance where Alicia was written in as the character destined to fall. She clenched the file tighter, her fingernails pressing into her skin. The pain was just enough to keep her awake. She had endured this too many times. As a public defender, as the voice for the poor who had been stripped of their own, as a woman who walked into rooms where justice was always defined by rank and race. But today was different. Today she stood across from a federal judge, a man who not only held power but was actively using it as a weapon to strike down anyone who dared break the performance. She looked around. No allies and no empathetic gazes, only blank expressions or ones quietly hoping she would fail. so things could return to the old order, an order in which she was never supposed to exist. And in that stage of pretense and precision, Alicia understood one thing. If she stumbled today, they wouldn't just silence a courtroom. They would extinguish the hope of all those who once believed truth might still have a chance in this system. But Alicia Monroe hadn't come here to accept the role written for her. She was not a supporting character. And even if every single person in the room chose to play the villain, she would be the one to rewrite the script. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent as Alicia placed the original contract on the projector. The official agreement between the city and Charles Stanton's real estate development company. One number stood out, $12.5 million. The approved budget for the redevelopment of the city's East Side residential zone. Then she moved to the second document. The latest financial report from the Federal Budget Office, $24.8 million, nearly double. All eyes began to widen, but no one said a word. "What matters most," Alicia said, her voice calm as if reporting the weather, "is the document that authorized this overspending and the person who signed it." The third file appeared on the screen, a single sheet of paper. Thin yet carrying the weight of a wrecking ball crashing into the scales of justice. At the bottom of the page, signed clearly and unmistakably, Howard R. Whitaker, the presiding judge of this very trial. No one spoke. Even breathing seemed hesitant. The bailiff stood stiff. The court clerk looked down at her desk. The jury blinked, stunned. A woman in the back row gasped into her hand and whispered, "Oh my God." Alicia didn't look at the screen. She looked straight up at the bench. "This evidence," she said clearly. A federal judge was handcuffed and dragged from the very seat of power he once used to crush justice, right in front of live television cameras. What seemed like an unthinkable event was no Hollywood movie. It happened in a real American courtroom, and the one who ignited this seismic reckoning was a black female prosecutor, Alicia Monroe. Without shouting, without dramatic rage, she wielded truth as her weapon and courage as her shield. In a courtroom where every eye expected her to fail, Alicia turned the very stage of power into a spotlight revealing the true face of the system, rotten, biased, and all too willing to protect those who know how to manipulate it from within. This wasn't just a trial, it was a warning. If you think you're too small to move justice, read this story. Because she did. 8 a.m. The federal courthouse in the American South. The atmosphere was so heavy it felt as if even the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to erupt. Alicia Monroe, the black attorney known for overturning major cases, walked steadily across the cold stone floor. Her stride was firm, her charcoal gray suit hugging a strong frame, one hand clutching a red-marked case file. State of Texas versus Gregory Stanton, embezzlement of public funds. She had faced corrupt cops, had stood in the deadly gray zone between justice and injustice, but today was different. Not because the case was harder, but because of the name on the bench, Ronald Whitaker. The heavy wooden door swung open. Alicia didn't glance at the jury or the rows of public seating. Her eyes locked directly onto the cold steel gaze of Whitaker. No nod, no greeting. He simply glanced at his watch, then looked at her as if to say, "What are you doing here? You think you belong?" And in that one look, Alicia understood. This wasn't a trial. This was a trench of power, and she was the outsider, seen as a threat. At the defendant's table, Gregory Stanton, a well-known real estate mogul from Dallas, was smirking, whispering something to his private attorney. His hand casually spun the bezel of a Rolex as if attending a gala, not standing trial for millions in vanished taxpayer money. Alicia set her case file on the table, catching a glimpse of 3 reporters adjusting their cameras in the last row. Today's trial was open to the public. She knew every move, every breath would be scrutinized like shattered glass beneath a spotlight. But what stopped her cold wasn't the cameras. It wasn't the murmurs or the weight of expectation. It was the image of an elderly black woman in a worn coat, being scolded by security for sitting in the wrong row. She bowed her head, apologizing with quiet embarrassment, while the white man next to her, sprawled across almost 2 seats, wasn't told a word. It wasn't about seating. It was a message, silent, ruthless. Clear power here still belonged to a certain skin color. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind her. Alicia stood still for a second. She took a deep breath, adjusted her collar, and walked straight into the courtroom. In front of her wasn't just a case, it was a system. One long accustomed to pushing people like her to the margins, a system that had learned to plug its ears to the truth. And today, Alicia hadn't come to ask for a seat. She came to reclaim justice, right in the fortress of injustice itself. The moment Alicia stepped into the courtroom, the air thickened. Cold stares turned toward her in unison. No longer out of curiosity, but with scrutiny, with judgment, as if they already knew who she was and were simply waiting for her to slip, just to confirm it. Stanton's defense attorney, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit that looked like he had just left a private cocktail party for the elite, tilted his head slightly toward Judge Whitaker. His eyes seemed to say, "Another one of those lawyers." Whitaker responded by tapping his fingers slowly on the file before him, deliberately dragging out each second like a background score to the performance he believed he was directing. He raised his head, casting a lazy glance at Alicia, as if she were merely a disruption to his workday. Then, without mentioning the case or acknowledging her role, he said bluntly, "I hope Ms. Monroe isn't here to turn this courtroom into a stage." No one in the room reacted. No one spoke up in her defense. Just a sharp, cold chuckle from the back row, quiet enough not to be called rude, loud enough to wound. Alicia didn't flinch. No furrowed brows, no step backward, but in her chest something ached. Not because of the words, but because of the complicity. The collective silence of the entire room, from the court clerk to the security staff. Everyone was playing the same scene, a performance in which Alicia was the side character, written solely to fall. She gripped the case file tighter, her nails digging into her palm. The sting of pain was just enough to keep her grounded. She'd been through this before. As a public defender, it was obtained under a subpoena issued by the Department of Justice and has been stored in the federal database. It is authentic and irrefutable. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair, hands folded as though browsing a lunch menu, not facing irrefutable evidence of his own wrongdoing. Then he smirked. Invalid. One word, crisp, final. Alicia blinked. She hesitated for just a breath. Excuse me, Your Honor. This document is forged. I declare it inadmissible. Move on. No reasoning, no citation of law, no explanation. Just a cold decree issued by the very man accused. The entire courtroom snapped back to a brutal truth. What is the law if the one in power sits above it? A man in the back murmured, "But he really did sign that." No one responded. No one dared, because they all knew. Touching power was stepping into forbidden territory. Alicia remained standing, even as the truth was swept aside like trash. Not because she was surprised, but because she knew. This was no longer a trial. It was a stage, and the lead actor was now both the referee and the offender. She took a deep breath and said slowly, "Then, with your permission, I'll proceed with the audio evidence." No one in the room knew that in just a few seconds a familiar voice would tear off the mask of power that the system had spent a lifetime protecting. The courtroom was dead silent as Alicia bent down beside her case, pulling out a small device and connecting it directly to the main speaker system. She pressed a button. A faint crackling sound emerged. Then the room was ripped apart by a deep, unmistakable voice. "Make sure that girl never gets near the ledger." The sound thundered like a storm inside a sealed chamber. Several people in the back row flinched. A reporter dropped their recorder. A police officer gripped the railing tightly. And the man seated highest, Judge Howard Whitaker, turned pale as ash. Alicia didn't say a word. She simply stood there, her eyes locked onto Whitaker. There was no anger in her gaze now. Her eyes were sharp like a blade, not to threaten but to dissect the truth. No confirmation was needed. Everyone knew. That was his voice, unmistakable. No excuse could change it. Whitaker shifted in his seat as if gravity had suddenly turned on him. Then he growled. But this time the usual coldness was gone. His voice trembled, cracked. "This recording is illegal. It's inadmissible in court." Alicia immediately pulled out a set of documents stamped in red from the federal prosecutor's office. "This is the legal authorization for the recording signed 3 weeks ago under a special investigation order with verification from both the federal inspector and internal security division." The papers were placed on the table. Neat. No extra words needed. The air in the room shifted instantly. Jurors whispered. A woman in the back row gripped her friend's hand. A young man softly murmured, "It's real. That's his voice." Whitaker tried to remain composed but failed. His face flushed red, then began to turn purple. He shot up from his chair. I'm ending this trial. This is a farce. I have the authority." "No, you don't." Alicia interrupted, but she didn't raise her voice. That sentence came out with a calmness so strange, it rang louder than any shout. The whole room held its breath. Alicia took one step forward. "You do not have the authority to deny the truth. Not when you are the one who twisted justice. In the name of justice." No one moved. No one spoke. Because the unimaginable had become real. A federal judge exposed by his own evidence right there on the bench. This was no longer a trial. It was a moment when all of America, from janitors to law students, from war veterans to third-grade girls, understood. Justice, if not protected by courage, is nothing but an empty coat hanging on the wall of power. And today a young woman with eyes that never looked down tore that coat open for the whole world to see the raw truth inside. The silence in the courtroom lasted precisely 10 seconds, just long enough for everyone to realize that history had changed. The back door creaked open, the dry sound of old hinges cutting through the stillness. 2 federal agents in deep blue uniforms entered, the light reflecting off their badges like a silent declaration. Alicia didn't turn around. She remained still, eyes never leaving the man who once sat atop the throne of authority. One of the agents pulled a document from his chest pocket, and his voice rang out as clear as a church bell. Judge Howard Whitaker, by order of the Federal Department of Justice, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, and complicity in the embezzlement of public funds. The room shook, not from the sound itself, but from the meaning carried in every word. Those who had once stood beside him, court clerks, assistants, security guards, now stood in silence. No one dared touch him, as if the power had melted off him in a single moment. There were no arguments, no more defenses, only a pair of trembling hands extended forward, and the unmistakable click of the handcuffs closing. That sound echoed like a final verdict from some invisible voice within the conscience of America. No one spoke as he was led past Alicia, and she said nothing either. Their eyes met briefly. There was no longer arrogance in his eyes, only raw fear, not fear of the handcuffs, but fear that the truth had finally caught up with him. The door shut behind them with a heavy bang, like the closing of a gate behind a fallen empire of lies. But Alicia didn't revel in the moment. She stood quietly like a milestone that needed no spotlight. Because she knew this was not her personal victory. It was the moment when justice walked through the doors of power, unbowed, unafraid. The man who once ruled the legal system from the highest seat now left it like any other defendant. Not because Alicia was stronger, but because this time the truth had someone brave enough to stand for it, and the price the system once used to crush the powerless, silence, fear, and authority, no longer worked on someone like her. When the door slammed shut behind Howard Whitaker, echoing like a final bell, the entire courtroom froze for a few heartbeats. People were still seated, but no one sat as straight as before. The silence was no longer the suffocating pressure of power weighing down on the powerless. It was the stunned realization of an undeniable truth, that a federal judge, a man who had once presided over hundreds of rulings, was in fact a criminal. But Alicia did not let her thoughts drift in the aftermath. She had not waited for this moment to watch a man fall. She had waited to look into the eyes of the next one, Charles Barrington. The man who once smiled with smug satisfaction, once crossed his legs like a king of real estate, was now visibly trembling. His fingers tapped nervously on the desk. His collar tightened. Sweat beaded on his forehead. And his eyes no longer dared to meet anyone else's. No one had handcuffed him yet. No one had called his name. But he knew. The seat Whitaker had just vacated was now reserved for him. Alicia walked slowly toward the defendant's table, her gaze void of anger. Instead, it carried something heavier. Certainty. No shouting, no threats, just one sentence as solid as steel. You just witnessed what happens to a man who thought he was untouchable." Barrington swallowed hard, his throat dry. He turned toward his attorney, Tom, but no one answered. His entire legal team suddenly looked small, like people who had just realized the ship they were rowing was no more than a rotting raft. Alicia produced a thick, weighty file, packed with names, and slid it gently across the table. "Your signature, next to Whitaker's. You think you're not on the next arrest list?" Barrington's face turned ghostly pale, as if every mask had been stripped away, revealing a man curling inward at the sight of his own downfall. I need protection," he whispered. For the first time, his voice carried no trace of wealth, only fear. Alicia did not nod. She did not smile. She simply looked at him like a single link in a chain, because she knew Charles Barrington was not the center of the crime. He was just another man who played by the rules of those who made them. She pulled out a cooperation agreement, placed it on the table, and set a pen beside it. "I need the list, all of it." Everyone held their breath, and in the middle of the courtroom that had once choked justice with power, now stood the same place where a man from the highest peak had to bow his head and sign to begin the unmasking of a rotting system. A system that Alicia, fueled by a fire that had never cooled, was now determined to ensure would never survive another day. Just 1 week after the trial that shook the nation, Capitol Hill, the symbol of American power, no longer echoed with hollow promises or empty debates. That day, each of Alicia Monroe's footsteps on the marble floor resonated like a war drum waking the people. Wearing a simple black blazer, her hair tied neatly, her eyes carried no hint of victory, only one truth. It was time for this country to look itself in the mirror. Behind her, the American flag fluttered in the spring wind, not as a symbol of pride, but as a solemn reminder that justice had once been sold cheap beneath this very dome. Alicia did not read from a speech. She didn't need paper. Standing before hundreds of lawmakers, reporters, and a nation watching on screens, she spoke with the weight of years spent witnessing too much injustice. "I am not here to recount a trial," she began, her voice sharp as a blade cutting through the veil of a broken system. "I'm here to remind you all that if someone like Howard Whitaker could sit on the bench for nearly 2 decades, then the fault lies not just with him, but with all of us. Because we stayed silent. Because we accepted it." Behind her, an older woman broke down in tears. Perhaps she had lost a child to a senseless verdict. A Black War veteran stood up, hand clenched, not in rage, but perhaps because, for the first time in his life, someone had finally said out loud what he had always known. Alicia looked at them, then stared straight into the TV cameras, knowing millions of eyes were locked on her. "When a man in a black robe can turn the courtroom into a tool for the rich," she said, "then the law is no longer the foundation of justice. It becomes a weapon to hide crimes." No one interrupted, no one turned away. Then suddenly someone stood up, then another, then dozens more. No applause, no cheering, just stillness. But that silence was louder than any ovation. It was a pledge that they had awakened. Alicia did not smile. She lowered her voice and spoke her final words not as a prosecutor or a politician, but simply as a human being. "No one is untouchable. There is no seat of power too high to be brought down, if it is built on lies. And if we truly want to build a just America, then we, Each of us must be willing to stand, to let our anger not drown in silence, but become the reason why no one else has to fall like this again. Across the country, in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, an 8-year-old girl sat silently in front of an old TV, her eyes wide, unblinking. She didn't understand all the powerful words Alicia used, but she understood that look. The look of a woman who had endured enough but refused to kneel. Beside her, her mother, a night shift nurse just home from work, sat on the floor exhausted, but unable to look away from the screen. When Alicia spoke her final line, "Let our anger become justice for those who have never been protected," the little girl turned to her mother and whispered, "Mom, I want to be like her." No one heard that whisper in the chamber, but it carried more weight than any bill passed that day. Because from that quiet voice, a generation had begun to see the world with new eyes. Not because justice had been perfected, but because now they knew. If Alicia Monroe could stand up and change an entire system, then one day, so could they. And that is the beginning of a truly just America. From the hearing that shook Congress to the quietest corners of neighborhood streets, the name Alicia Monroe was no longer known only in legal circles. It had become a living symbol for an America that dared to look truth in the eye, even when that truth was so painful it made the entire system tremble. But for Alicia, this was not an ending. She did not accept medals. She did not appear on talk shows to recount a victory, because for her, this was never a victory. It was merely the first crack in a wall that had stood for centuries. In the federal prosecutor's office in Washington, the morning light slipped through the window and fell across a fresh stack of files on her desk. Red folders stamped "Top Secret." Inside was a list of dozens of names: judges, business executives, politicians, even high-ranking officials, all tied to the very system that Howard Whitaker and Charles Lansing had once controlled. For years, they had orchestrated not just a corruption case, but an entire underground network of manipulation. From urban redevelopment budgets to public contracts, from housing to criminal sentences. Alicia sat in thought, her hand resting on a coffee mug, her gaze fixed on one particular name. That of a sitting U.S. senator who had publicly championed judicial reform, yet was the first to sign off on funding for Lansing's ghost projects. Outside her office, her colleague Ryan Keller stepped in, lowering his voice. "We're about to stir up a hornet's nest. Are you sure about this?" Alicia gave a slight nod, then answered calmly, "I'm not dragging them into the light for revenge. I'm doing this because the people deserve to know who's been writing the laws to profit from their silence." She looked up at the whiteboard on the wall, pinned with the faces of the harmed. Workers defrauded out of homes. Single mothers who lost custody due to biased rulings. Veterans wrongly convicted simply because they didn't have a skilled attorney. They weren't in newspapers, but they were the reason Alicia knew she couldn't stop. A few days later, in a confidential internal meeting at the Department of Justice, she presented a report hundreds of pages long. In the dead quiet room, line by line, piece by piece, from bank transfers to internal audio recordings, every shred of evidence pointed to one thing. The system wasn't broken. It had been designed that way, to serve only those who knew how to manipulate it, those who could sit on the bench and be the very ones ordering the destruction of evidence. But this time, Alicia wasn't alone. The colleagues who once hesitated now stood with her. Young prosecutors, investigators who had been reassigned, former public defenders who had once been threatened. They came back, not for reputation, but because they had seen one thing. Someone dared to light the match, and now the fire was spreading. On television, the morning news no longer led with celebrity scandals. Instead, the investigation initiated by Prosecutor Monroe appeared on every headline. The public began to speak out. Families who once kept quiet about their children's wrongful convictions began sending thank you letters. A man who had lost his job for suing a major corporation stood before a courthouse and said, "I used to think I didn't deserve to be heard. But now I know justice doesn't sleep. It just needs someone to call its name." Alicia Monroe did not call herself a hero. She didn't need to. But with every step, with every new case file, she was rewriting a principle this country had long forgotten. Justice is not granted from above. It is upheld by those who refuse to be silent, by those who dare to stand in the dark and say, "I see you, and I am not afraid." And in a small corner of an elementary school classroom in Detroit, a 9-year-old girl, who had once sat silently through the trial aired on the class screen the year before, was now writing an essay titled, "Justice Begins with a Question." She didn't remember all the legal terms Alicia had used, but she remembered Alicia's eyes, and that alone was enough for her to believe that one day she too could do the right thing, not because she was allowed to, but because she couldn't stay silent. Alicia's story did not end in a courtroom. It begins again, every day, in the hearts of people who now understand justice does not come on its own. It is born from resilience, from anger that knows how to lead, and from a quiet oath spoken in defiance. No one, no matter how powerful, should ever be allowed to escape the truth.